Okay, we have time for about 5 questions, and what I'd like you to do is, if you can, identify the candidates you want to hear from, so we, because I don't think we have time to hear from everybody. So please identify yourself and give your question.
I'm Dan Barr. I'm 76 years old. I've been in this fishery for 37 years, and I really have 2 questions. One's on prosperity and one's on rape. The run on prosperity, 10 years ago I met with the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House because I'd been to the Oregon Business Plan, which Michael Porter at Harvard Business School says the best state development plan in the country. And the governor and the U.S. senators walk away from there. I've heard the community factor the complexity, look at the clusters and look at the log jam, and I'm going to make things happen. Do you know about the Oregon Business Plan, and will you make a prosperity plan? The President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House said we deserve it. Seattle companies are not going to do it. Alaska needs to do it. My second question for 35...
Okay, let's start with your first question. Who do you want to answer that?
Well, Governor, in terms of, and Mead, both of you might have some familiarity with that or some things. If you'd care to comment, I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
You know, the fisheries issue as far as how those allocation issues, those kind of issues of what's best for Alaska has been a challenge for a lot of governors, and I'm looking forward to our discussion tomorrow to be able to address that.
Mead?
Dan, it's nice to see you again. We actually spoke on a panel about that program, or you spoke about that program in Seattle a few years ago. I think we have to have an Alaska First policy that really means Alaska First in terms of value added here. To me, if our energy prices are driving salmon to be processed in China rather than here with jobs for Alaskans, that's a problem. If our royalty policy means that we are importing oil for our jets from Singapore while our refineries get closed or undone, that's a problem. We have a problem in that we are not looking at value added off the North Slope, and Mark can talk about, and I don't disagree with Mark on diversifying our economy, but on the stuff we have that's paying the bills, we're not doing the job. And so that prosperity plan has to look at what we've got, how do we grow our cash cows, and then how do we help grow these new industries. And the fishing industry has not had the same kind of efforts on innovation that Laney talked about that it could have. We've seen in Iceland and other places, and our efforts with the oil industry are actually way, way, way behind the times.
All right, thank you, Mead Treadwell. Could we have you defer your questions just so we can have someone else get a crack and go, and then if we have time at the end, we'll go back to you. Oh. Please come to the microphone and give us your name and your question and identify the candidates you want to address this.
Hello, my name is Sheila Ring. My question is directed towards Governor Walker and Begich. Internet service is a huge part of our daily lives now. It is now common practice for people to use the internet depending on the need or the online requirement. In rural communities across Alaska, this 21st century service is either non-existent or insufficient. Both the internet and cell phone users across rural communities in Alaska are affected by the lack of better infrastructure and inadequate broadband speed with costly package plans. What are your thoughts on this subject?
Mark, why don't you take the first crack at it?
Sure. First off, I agree with what you're saying in the sense of that it's a problem. When I was in the U.S. Senate, I worked very hard to bring dollars, especially to rural Alaska, to help improve the internet system, broadband. Without that for our state, it doesn't matter if it's urban or rural, especially rural, you'll have huge problems with growing the economy and also delivering medical and education. But here's what I would do. When people talk about infrastructure, usually the way the legislature and everyone talks about it's roads, bridges, it's those what I would call core basic last 50-year talk. Broadband is the new utility. We have to include that in the discussion and I've proposed an idea of a 5-year bond. The idea would be over the next 5 years, we're going to allocate a certain amount of money for projects that are generated from the community that we can partner. Broadband is critical. Just as we built an interstate highway system years ago in the country and electrification, this is our new utility. Without it, we will not survive long-term economically. So you will see me talk about infrastructure, but this will be part of it, as I did when I was in the U.S. Senate, as I did when I was mayor of Anchorage. I will do it as governor.
Bill?
I recently had a meeting with the president of Microsoft, who made the announcement that by July 4th of 2022, they will have all of rural America covered with high-speed broadband. My suggestion to him is he would start that on an alphabetical order and do Alaska first. He did not say no, but it's something that is absolutely critical that we have that. It's shocking what we don't have in the way of that kind of communication. Without that, that is holding back a tremendous amount of opportunity in the state of Alaska. I could not be more supportive of that. We've had a number of proposals to do that. The question is which method we use, and that's being looked at as well, but it's a very high priority.
All right, next question.
Thank you.
My name is Wesley Foster. I address my question to Senator Begich. Sustainability is the tune of tonight's debate. The fishers want to come, return. The fish want to return. The processors want to return. The captains and crews want to return. We think of the generations that want to return, to come back to this wonderful portion of Alaska. Some may even vote for one of you 5 gentlemen in years to come. Some may even want to pay taxes, state and local taxes. Abortion kills. What are your thoughts on sustainability of human life and how abortion kills that?
So which candidates?
Senator Begich.
I am pro-choice. I do not believe government has a role in telling women what to do with their bodies. I also believe that you need to have a comprehensive health programs for women of all levels, and I'm pro-choice. That's it.
All right, next question.
Hello, William Weatherby. I live here in King Salmon, well, just up the road. Sustainability in rural Alaska means a bit different than people that live in Anchorage or the Matsu Valley or Juneau. We rely on sustainability of our fish and game. That can fluctuate, and it's fairly well managed. The budget doesn't seem to have been sustainable lately, but one thing that's been a fairly sustainable rock and that benefits the people of rural Alaska more than in other places has been the permanent fund dividend. We, as residents of Alaska, are like shareholders in a corporation that receives a dividend. I would like to hear a strong statement from each of you, but in the interest of time, I'm sure the 4 challengers will post something and have a strong statement if they don't already. So I turn my question to Bill Walker, who had a strong statement at one point in time, but like he said earlier, he had to cut the dividend in half. Tough choice, sure. And the money went back into the fund, well, in the Earnings Reserve Fund. And I don't believe it has been spent yet. It was taken from us in 2016 and hasn't been spent yet. What was so important that you had to keep that back from all the families here in rural Alaska?
Thank you for the question. I'd love to clarify that issue because there's a lot of mis and half quotes that are made upon that. You know, I ran for governor. I had no intention of doing that because at that time we had a $1.6 billion deficit, and that was certainly could be dealt with as a result of the cut, to which we did cut $1.7 billion as far as spending. So that could have been the case. Oil dropped to $26. We were in $3.7 billion deficit. We were going through $14 billion and ultimately went through 12 with the $14 billion. So yes, the circumstances changed, and I could have done something very politically correct to be able to step back and say, I'm not going to touch that. I'm absolutely not going to touch that. It became very clear, and it was time for Alaska to make the turn that we knew we were going to have to get to. We were going to have to draw out of that fund. The goal is to raise that amount, that fund, grow that fund. So when we let me finish the question. And so when we, or the answer, when we draw out of that fund for both the operation of government and for the dividend, it's as high as possible, so that we sustain. The critical thing is we sustain the fund. If we overdraw that fund, it'd be like overfishing our system and losing fish as a result of that. So it was to grow the fund so that when we draw out of it, it is sustainable and it goes on for years. And that's why when the legislature, you know, the Senate Republicans voted first to make the reduction I did on the POMV. I took my action, and since then the legislature has voted twice now since. So, you know, it's a matter of our future. Do we want to protect the fund or not protect the fund?
The question
All right, thank
was,
you.
what
And
did
can
you spend it on?
Sir,
He didn't answer the question.
Sir, I think we're in the interest of moving on. Thank you. That was a very good question to ask. Let's have our next questioner.
Thank you all for being here today. My name is Dr. Catherine Ringsmith, and I have a PhD because I slimed fish here in Bristol Bay. History is very important to me. I know history is very important to many of the people here, and you know I'm here, some of you know I'm here to present a big history project that we're working on. So the question that I have, I also teach at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. I teach history, Alaska history, U.S. history, and we've talked a lot about science, we've talked a lot about biology, we talked about certainly about economics, which are all absolutely central and vital to our future. But my question is, how do you feel about the role of history, and how does the whole role of history help cultivate the next generation of Alaska leaders, which we so desperately need? Thank you very much.
So let's pick a candidate to answer that.
I'll go with Mead Treadwell. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ringsmith. First off, I'm one of the folks at Commonwealth North that helped create with the Humanities Forum, the Alaska history requirement in the schools. And have also, after my son was assigned a teacher who had just gotten to Alaska, didn't know any Alaska history, got him involved in working to improve it. I was head of the Alaska Historical Commission, and I believe that what you're doing with the North Naknek Cannery is absolutely special for the state, and support you, and I'm sorry I can't go over there and visit tomorrow. But here's the thing, the history we have to know. We're losing lots of history when we lose native languages, and that's why I work to help create official native languages in the state. We're losing lots of history when we don't understand the innovations we've had. And I mentioned the kayak, but the blanket toss, the halibut hook. Governor Walker and I, were there at when we awarded that as part of that. We lose a lot when we forget the history of what was in our Statehood Act. I went and read every version of the Statehood Act and realized how we got our land and how we got the division of revenues, and I'm not seeing government stand up for our history, and we need to do that. I wrote my history paper in college on Bristol Bay and the Japanese ships coming in here and stealing all our fish, and the U.S. setting a position against a 200-mile limit that almost killed off our fisheries inshore and offshore for 40 years. We've got to understand history or we're going to lose the battles.
All right, thank you.
That's why I believe what you're doing is important.
Thank you. Next question.
In the early 70s, there was almost no fishing here because of the Japanese 12 miles off. I got the High Seas Drift Net Moratorium and Enforcement Act through Congress, the last piece of legislation, the first President Bush, so there was teeth on the high seas. Bristol Bay is still being raped down in Area M in the North Peninsula, where sometimes 92% of the fish are headed for the bay because those fishermen have collected a fund and have been able to get the appointments from the governor. We need, and I'm asked this to any of the three candidates who have not been in the governor's office, which policy would you do to help get terminal fisheries back where they should be, and this interpret fishery of a Japanese company and 400 fishermen corking off Bristol Bay to get those fish returning to Bristol Bay? Thank you.
So we'll start with Mike Dunleavy on this, and then we'll go to Scott Hawkins to answer that one.
Again, fish, in my opinion, the resources of Alaska belong to Alaskans, and we should do whatever we can to enforce that those resources stay within the state and are capitalized by residents of the state of Alaska. Enforce our laws, change laws when necessary to, once again, meet that goal of making sure that the resources are for Alaskans, appoint the right people, and make sure they do their job.
All right, next question. Oh, wait a minute, Scott was going to answer that one.
And I'd like to...
Mark, just let Scott, because he hasn't had any questions, and then you can follow up.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Well, I will also, again, say how important it is that we respect science and that we appoint people to key boards and commissions and governing bodies that really do respect the science, and also enforce the existing laws and treaties that we have. I still have a lot to learn in this area of fisheries management and fisheries politics, but we do need to stand up for Alaska first when it comes to fisheries management, and we do need to respect the commercial fishing industry. It's very important that when we send people to key boards and commissions like the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council or the State Board of Fish, that we don't send people that have a political axe to grind. And I think it's important that when we choose those people, we choose people that do have a healthy respect for the historical role that commercial fishing has played in this state and how important it is to families.
I'll be real quick, and that is, first off, I know a couple years ago was the first time the Board of Fish did not have someone from this region. That will never happen under me. Second, I would put back into place in the governor's office a fisheries advisor, which is critical. Every governor's usually had one to make sure they have the understanding of what's going on around the community. And third, is the governor has a significant role. Fish is like oil. The difference is, and I heard this, I love this from someone who told me this, this area is the Prudhoe Bay of fish. This is the gold mine. This is what is an asset that we have to make sure as a governor, you're advocating not just in state, but the laws in Washington and making sure the right people are interpreting what we believe is right and making sure the governor is a big player in that arena.
All right, thank you. Another question?
Thank you. This question is for any of the candidates who have not served in the governor's office. The research is clear and the science on the benefits of early childhood education and early intervention to young children in need of support. Can you please share with us your unique perspective or plan to ensure that our youngest children are supported through universal preschool in the state of Alaska?
I'll start. It's critical. We have to focus on ages 4 through 8. We have to focus on pre-K through 3rd grade to ensure that all of our students can read at the end of 3rd grade. The research is clear that if you can't read at the end of 3rd grade, you get some serious problems going through school. They've done all kinds of research on folks that are incarcerated, what their reading levels were, what their experience was in school. It's absolutely critical that our kids are reading by 3rd grade. And as a result, we have to cost shift. We have to move funding into that area to make sure that we have kids, all of our children are reading, and use the best research methods. And there's a lot of good research out there. There's some states that are doing some good things in early childhood education and literacy. It's absolutely critical. And I'll just add, by the time they're in 8th grade, just a little switch, by the time they're in 8th grade, they also have to be fluent in algebra. That's another gatekeeper course for folks to get involved in science. But ages 4 through 8 are absolutely critical. We've got to focus on that. We have to have the outcomes that we know that we expect and we need to have for our children.
Scott Hawkins, and then I'll go to Mark Begich, because I believe you wanted the candidates that did not serve in the governor's office.
Yeah, early childhood education is extremely important. Traditionally, it's been provided by families, and with the breakdown of the family unit, that's what's brought forward the need for public, or outside investment in early childhood education. I mean, an active and engaged parent can provide everything we need in that regard, but not every child has that luxury. And unfortunately, the state right now, in our fiscal situation, we don't have the luxury of massive expansion of educational programs. But I think communities can do this. I think communities can work together and pull together resources from different entities, from the borough, from the CDQ groups, and the state can be a partner in that too. It's a tough problem because the need is there, the need is clear. The question is, how do we afford it at a time when we're running deficits and needing to reduce and not expand government?
Good. When I talked about the permanent fund earnings, 50% going to dividend, 10% inflation improving, 40% for education includes preschool. Because without that, you will not complete the whole program. It is no question. We were fortunate with Jacob. We could afford Montessori. Unbelievable value that we see every single day in those early years of education. But I also will say this on early education. For example, the program here, the Little Angel child care program here, they're waiting still to get the final permitting necessary, certification, so they can take NSAP money, which they cannot take yet. That's a state issue. It shouldn't take a year to do that. We should do everything we can to ensure that early education, early child care is available and accessible. Child care used to be many, many years ago just a place to drop your kid off. Now it's early childhood education. That's what it's about. And we have to think about it. Also, the biggest problem is getting people to work in this field that make a livable wage. Because there's young people who want to do this. I see them every day. But when they see what it pays, even though they love kids, they won't do it. So we have to figure out how to help that. And businesses are big provider or potential opportunity here because they see the economic value of kids who have great education, especially early education, and is cheap compared to later in years.
Okay, I want to thank you. We've got one more question, and then what I'd like to do just to wrap things up is I'd like to have Bill Hill and Sharon Thompson, because they are from this community, and a lot of people approach them with questions to ask, so they will end things for us. So this is the last question from the audience.
In a matter of just a few years, the permanent fund went from about $40 billion to $65 billion about. It seems that the only danger that the permanent fund has is fluctuations in stock markets, but it's very well diversified and will probably be handled well into the future. So the only danger is legislators who take back part of the permanent fund dividend or cut it down and call it an increase. So my question to Mr. Dunleavy is, if you're elected governor, how do you keep the permanent fund dividend sustainable and keep the elected officials, the legislators, away from it?
You follow the law. You follow the law that's on the books and has been on the books for decades. You submit a budget with that calculation in the budget. The permanent fund is not the problem. Never was the problem. And no one ever, this is interesting, no one ever complained about the PFD, the amount of the PFD, ever, until it was vetoed. They accepted the fluctuations, as you said. We don't have a PFD problem, we have a spending problem. And because we can't control our spending, we went after the PFD. And I got to tell you, folks, once we go after the PFD, taxes are next.
All right, and so I'd like to go to Bill Hill. Do you have a question for a candidate, and identify which ones you want to answer that?
Oh, boy. I kind of wanted to hear answers from more than one on this. It does involve 3 communities, so if that would be allowable, that'd be great. A little leeway for the local? All right. My grandma, Katie Trefon, was a Dena'ina woman who used the land and lived a subsistence lifestyle. My family and others like it continue to consider this a very important part of our identity and our lives. The Katmai National Park and Preserve historically has increased its footprint several times, and in doing so has taken away some of the access that we've traditionally had, some of the uses that we traditionally had, some of the subsistence that we traditionally had from the peoples of the King Salmon Tribal Council, the South Naknek Village Council, and the Naknek Native Village Councils. In fact, you know, there are people in the communities who don't call it the Katmai National Park and Preserve, but they call it the Katmai Cancer. Would you support efforts to regain the traditional rights and access to those areas? And what is your view on the size of the footprint of the federal government in Alaska and the control it wields in our state?
It's way too big, and absolutely, I would push back on the federal government, and it's a problem. Hopefully, with this new administration, they're going to be a little more friendly to the state of Alaska. But our land issues, as has been mentioned before, they're suffocating us. And they are changing our lifestyle, and they're changing our culture. And absolutely, I would push back on the footprint expanding and restore the rights that we had and should have regarding the lands in Alaska.
Bill Walker?
Yeah, we need to address that now aggressively with the administration. And here's why I say that. We have an administration now that is the most willing to look at what Alaska wants. I mean, we've in this administration we've opened the 1002. You know, the support for the support of the LNG project at the highest level. You know, they have the Eisenbeck Road. I was in Washington, D.C., and I've been meeting with Secretary Jewell for many times on that. Secretary Zinke, they signed the arrangement to be able to transfer land for that. So this is the time not to litigate necessarily. Sit down with them with a cup of coffee and say, let's resolve this, and I think we have a much better chance. This administration has been listening closely. My call last week with Secretary Sonny Perdue of Agriculture talking about the roadless rule as far as what we're going to do do on that, what the opportunity we have on that. So now is the time to address those. Absolutely, this is the time. I don't recommend litigation at this point. I recommend sitting down with a cup of coffee, and you speak very, very well on that issue. And the issue of subsistence and lifestyles is very important, obviously, in Alaska. And I think we have a much better chance with this administration to address that. Please bring that to me, and we will address that.
Mead?
I want to answer your question two ways. First off, when it came to recognition of tribes in Alaska and tribal powers, I was in the administration where the Attorney General's office said don't do anything with them. And we wanted better water and sanitation throughout rural Alaska, and we made deals with tribes. And that was in the early 90s in the Hickel administration. I'm very proud of that. I helped build capacity for the Tribal Health Corporation, and I believe what you're talking about in terms of partnerships between the state and tribes is very important, especially when it comes to federal powers. Okay, second, and Bill, I did bring you something. I brought you a report. I was lieutenant governor. You succeeded an administration I was part of. I came to you and I said, I'm going to chair an effort for the Citizens Advisory Committee on Federal Areas that's going to look at the issue of, do we ask for more land? Governor Wally Hickel said to me on his deathbed, we should have asked for more. We used a lot of state money. We used hours and hours of Alaska citizens' time. And that report was delivered with a recommendation to the governor that we ask for more land in these areas. We have not had a hearing on it. We couldn't get a hearing on it through the legislature. We couldn't get the time of day on it from the governor. And there is an agenda that a group of Alaskans have put together to address the issues that you've talked about.
Let me clarify that a little bit. Let me just respond, since Mead brings up my name frequently. You came and asked me to stay on a board so you could travel a lot, and I left you on that board, so you do travel a lot. But I will say this:
I didn't use a dime of state travel on either one of those.
Actually, this administration, the Attorney General at the AFN, John Lindenmuth, talked about and read and released an opinion about tribal sovereignty. As far as we recognize that, we're the first administration to do that. So you know, to say that we have not, or I know you have not, but to infer that we have not recognized tribes, we have recognized tribes, their sovereignty. We absolutely have done that.
Okay, Mark has been wanting to comment.
You know, in Anchorage, we have talk radio where people kind of go after. So I'm going to answer your question. First, I'll just clarify one thing. Knowles administration recognized tribes back in those days, but your question is yes to both. Okay, so we have that. But here's what we can do right now, and this is what another reason why I decided to run, because there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of committees, a lot of this, that. You got to actually just do some things. The Coastal Zone Management Plan, another way to get our control back from the federal government. The administrations of the past let it go. Simple legislation, working with the legislature, brings it back. Second, with the Magnuson-Stevens Act, when I was in the Senate, we worked for the first time to include the word subsistence in there, because it was never included. And we should have that in there. It's not just commercial, it's subsistence, it's sports, all of it. We're all one part of one big fisheries. And so subsistence needs to be part of that. Also, the state for decades, and I haven't, like I said, haven't served in Juneau in any capacity elected, but they have oversubscribed for the lands that are waiting to be turned over to the state of Alaska. But we've oversubscribed because we're not sure which lands yet. Well, if you want to complain about not getting the lands, then you should actually make the selection and get them. What I would do with that land, I'd do exactly what we did in Anchorage, put it into a land trust, so when those are sold or utilized for economic good, those go to the basic services of the state of Alaska in trust. We do that in Anchorage, successful over many years. But instead, what they usually do on these lands, they sell them off, plug the money into the budget one time, and the net result is next year it's gone. So we have to have longer-term thinking on it, but that's what I would do.
Thank you so much. So one more word on this, and then we move on to Sharon Thompson's question. And then we call it a day.
Or a night.
I can't be the only guy that doesn't weigh in on this. The thing about the federal government is that the federal government, if you don't push back on them, there's just relentless pressure for them to encroach on states' rights and the rights of other entities. And so it's very important that the governor of the state of Alaska have a very muscular defense of our land access issues and our basic sovereignty and our rights under the Statehood Compact and other subsequent legislation. If we have seen administrations in the past that were willing to kind of let the feds encroach, and we're willing to even let important lawsuits be dismissed with prejudice that doesn't let us bring them back in the future. And so it's just critically important that the governor of the state really be the tip of the spear and take on the federal government and stand up for our rights.
Sharon Thompson.
I would like to thank each of you for accepting our invitation to Bristol Bay Fish Expo. This fundraiser is a great example of how our natural resources, salmon in our case here, is not only sustaining our economy and culture in rural Alaska, but salmon are also supporting our kids' early childhood development. And we all know how important that is. Governor Walker, I heard you mention when my kids and I delivered you the 2 billionth commercially caught salmon in 2016, I heard you mention that salmon is our renewable permanent fund. And I really appreciate your policy of fish first. Many of us believe our most valuable resource is our kids. So my question is, how will each of you support and invest in Alaska's children, and whether you will incorporate a kids first policy into each decision you make as governor?
So let's go down the row here. We'll start with Governor Bill Walker and walk our way this way. And can you keep your answers brief, if that's possible?
Well, first, thank you for that excellent fish. A lot of people ask me what I did with the 2 billionth fish. I ate it. It seemed like it was the right thing to do, and it was absolutely delicious. So thank you very much for bringing that and acknowledging that. And I guess I would look at this area a bit different than Prudhoe Bay. Prudhoe Bay is non-renewable. This area is renewable. And so I'm very, very protective of that. When it comes to children, you know, I put on one of the special session calls, I'm the first governor that put a children issue for foster children on the special session call. You know, we have a children's cabinet, a sub-cabinet of, you know, specifically on children's issues. You're right, our greatest renewable resource in the state is our children. And so I know it's a cliche to say that, you know, I'm doing this because of my children, my grandchildren. I really am. You know, I really don't think I could, with where we were headed, the direction we were headed with the fiscal cliff we're headed towards, I couldn't live with myself to not do this. And it is about the next generation. It's certainly not about any of our generations up here. It really is about the next generation. And you know, the last speaker, the question about the early childhood education, we have funded that every year for that reason, because that's absolutely critical. That's not where we shortchange. So I will continue to fund early education. I will continue to default to children's issues associated with the safety of our children and for their protection. So you're absolutely right. And I don't think everybody up here would probably agree with that as far as the protection and safety of our children and for their education. So it's an extremely high priority, has been when I ran, has been during my administration, and will continue to be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you also for your question, and I agree this is something that we all are sticking together on. In my estimation as governor, I will be working to make sure that we take care of the kids who aren't being taken care of, and whether it's the foster program, or whether it's the domestic violence situation, whether it's kids who don't have lunches or breakfasts. These are things that are very important. But I also don't believe that we should build more entitlements in this state for families or anything else. We've got to strengthen families. And that's why I've spent almost all of my charitable time helping build educational programs. When my first wife died, we sent 10,000 kids to the Alaska Sea Life Center as a memorial to her. I've been on the board of the Boy Scouts. My wife has been helping the Girl Scouts. We've been very active in athletic programs. As Lieutenant Governor, I insisted when we did Arctic Winter Games with the last big chunk of money that was available for Arctic Winter Games that we got kids from rural Alaska involved. And there's so many things that we can do with all of us, because all of us care about our kids, to celebrate the experience that is better growing up. So thank you for your concern, and I will just say it one more time. We've got to get the resources out of the Capitol and into the communities, whether it's on protecting the environment or taking care of our kids or fighting crime, because it's the easiest thing for a bureaucrat to do is to cut the funding in the hustings, so to speak, and to keep their support at home, wherever the headquarters is.
So I'll try to give a pithier answer.
Pithy is good.
Pithy is good. The best thing we can do for our children is improve the performance of our public school system. Funding has increased. You compare our funding per student today to what it was 10 years ago, it's significantly higher, and that's per student. And yet performance is going the other direction. And that's the greatest disservice that we can do to our kids, is not giving them a decent education. And so we really need to dive into why is that performance going downhill. One is top-heavy administration, as I mentioned earlier. Two is a lack of accountability. We just don't have the mechanisms in our public school systems to hold individual teachers accountable for performance, or to hold entire schools and administrators accountable for performance. If performance drops, it just kind of continues to bump along and often drops again the following year. So to me, that is the absolute most highest priority, is turn around the performance of our public school system.
We have to create an environment for our kids to succeed in. We have to take a look at what are the issues impacting our children. Public safety has got to be #1 for the state of Alaska, and it has to start with our kids. We have to look at all the environments, all of the systems that are impacted kids. Educational system, once again, public safety. Do we have an economy for folks to be able to work in and produce jobs so they can have revenue and income to feed their families, to take care of their families? But I'll cut this short. We have to start, again, basically with our public safety issues. We have to make sure that the kids are taken care of first, that we have a police presence in most of our communities, which now we don't, and that when there are crimes committed, that those folks that are committing those crimes are held responsible, and that justice is swift. But the kids have to come first.
So your question was, is there a kids first or child first policy? You have to look at everything through that prism. And I have done this all my life. And I'll give you two examples. Well, I'll give you a couple quick ones. When we saw the correctional system years ago when I was on the Acreage Assembly for young people falling apart, I went to young people, youth court, and said, what can we do with first-time offenders? Help me figure this out. It was a state program in the sense of state probation officers. City of Anchorage funded a probation officer to help change this system in this cycle. I remember I was at Rainbow Connection, which is an incredible program for young people who are disabled, riding horses, therapeutic, and this young 13-year-old was speaking. It was an auction with people screaming and yelling. She got them calm, collective, listening. I went to my staff, I was mayor, and I said, I want her on a board or commission. And they went up to her, she came over, my staff said, well, do you know how old she is? I said, I don't really care, how old is she? She said, 13 years old. I said, perfect. And so what did we do? We put her on the Parks and Rec Commission. Because if you're going to make kids first year policy, you have to actually engage them. And not give them lip service, not think we know all the answers. Engage them in meaningful ways, because every one of these young people that I saw that I brought into when I was mayor and put on boards and commissions or engaged them in active, real results, I have now seen them in the community doing amazing things. That's how you determine if you're going to have a kids first policy. Talking about is one, two is action, and three is including young people in the decision making.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, candidates, for putting in the extra mile. Yes. Thank you, audience. Everybody can go home. A standing ovation.